All right, so for my final, I had decided to do the topic of two paramedics versus one paramedic on board an ambulance as far as staffing concerns. And we discussed the pros and cons, which could range from everything from the cost to provider efficiency, skill practice, medication errors, as well as patient outcomes. Throughout my study, I found various resources that, surprisingly to me, um, really show the proof that one paramedic EMT combination groups provided better patient care than double paramedic groups. Um, Most paramedics that you talk to and most providers you talk to will say they feel more comfortable working with two paramedics compared to a paramedic EMT provider. And a lot of this is because with two paramedics, you're able to bounce ideas off the other medic. If for some reason you are uncomfortable with a certain skill, you can pass it on to your partner. Or if you're having trouble with an IV, you can let your partner do the IV, or same thing vice versa with an intubation. The problem that happens is when you have two paramedics, you get this dominance, submissive area that happens, and when one paramedic feels they're stronger than the other paramedic, they may take control of every single call. And now you're having one paramedic provide all the skills, making all the decisions, the other paramedic sitting back, and they're never really progressing as a provider. The big issue with this is now you're really training one good paramedic and one iffy paramedic that's really not getting any hands-on skills. So some of the studies we looked at also depicted like on-scene times, and while on-scene times were slightly shorter when you had two paramedics, you're really only saving maybe a minute, maybe 30 seconds when you have two paramedics versus a paramedic and an EMT. And a lot of this is because we simply don't do that many ALS skills. Really, on our calls, ALS skills are limited to almost an IV access for the majority of our calls. Our EMTs can still set up the saline lock sets or our drip sets, whatever we need. Our EMTs can still do 12 leads. They can do CPAP now. They can do, BLS airway adjuncts. They can take control of the airway. You're not really saving a lot of time by having a second paramedic unless you're having a difficult IV and you have somebody else that can take a look and do an IV with you. But you're really only saving about a minute's time. Other studies that I've seen showed that medication errors and provider decision making is actually worse with two paramedics. And this comes back to that provider submissive dominant thing where if you're unsure of your skill, you just look at your partner. You go, "What do you think I'm looking at? What do you think you're seeing here? What is this?" And they may say something like, "This is definitely CHF. This patient needs CPAP." Or "This is COPD. We got to give fluids with this patient who's got low blood pressure with this difficulty breathing." And the issue that happens is you might just automatically think your partner knows it all, and you won't question the decision. You might not listen to long silence. You might just go say, "Oh, you think we need fluids? We'll give fluids." And back if that was just you and an EMT, you'd go back to your own hands-on skills, you go back to your own knowledge, and as a medic, you would sit there and you go, "All right, well, what do I need to do? What am I looking at?" And you're trying to discuss it. And a great way to look at it is if you have an EMT, you can almost be teaching the EMT what you're seeing in your decision making. It reinforces good medic skills, it reinforces your knowledge, and it gives you the hands-on experience. In my study, one of the things I discussed in the paper was a rural fire department that has a population of roughly 10,000 patients, that they see 10 cardiac arrests a year. In that department, if they run double paramedic for all their calls, each paramedic may get each paramedic may be able to intubate once every other year because of their call volume. By running an EMT paramedic split, if you run a paramedic EMT split, you would get to do an intubation every other year. By doing a double medic, because you get to split the skills, you do your intubations half as much. So that same group of paramedics would actually be doing an intubation once every 4 years instead of every other year. So when you have double the paramedics on a truck, you're having the skills that they get to attempt. So by doing double paramedic groups, you end up reducing provider proficiency at necessary skills. Skills that are used during halo events, these high acuity events that they don't really get to practice that often. CPAP, medication administration, endotracheal intubation, various skills like that really depend on provider hands-on practice is limited when you do double paramedic crews. The big one that's obvious that people talk about is cost efficiency as well. I looked up the national average for EMTs versus the national average of paramedics, and it's roughly a $15,000 difference, or roughly 20 to 25% increase in wage by doing paramedics versus EMTs. With this a lot too is that when you're running two paramedics on a truck, you're spending an average of 12.5% increase to the company per year. That's a huge amount. I mean, just think if you got a 12.5% pay raise in year one you're one person. Like, you'd be like, that's ecstatic. That's thousands of dollars a year. Well, now if a company's doing that and they have 20 providers and that's a small department, they're spending $500,000 a year. It's They're gonna go crazy. And you can save so much money by splitting up an EMT and a paramedic. So to keep this fairly short, from the studies I saw, it's better patient outcomes when you have an EMT paramedic. You have on-scene times that are roughly the same. Your cardiac arrest scenarios do not differ by any means. Patient outcomes actually tend to improve in these high acuity scenarios when you have a paramedic EMT, and it's simply because you transport quicker. You realize the direness of the situation, you realize that this patient needs advanced care, and you're one person. So instead of messing around trying to intubate 3-4 times, you say, I can't get the tube, just go to the hospital, we'll BLS the airway. And the patient gets seen by a doctor and seen by advanced practitioners at a much faster rate, and it provides better patient outcomes. So cost redundant, reduce, and then as well. So from overall, what I've learned is that being a paramedic provider with an EMT is beneficial to not only the provider, but the company and then the service area to which they provide.